our anchor, Mfundo Mabalane, is currently standing by to give us the very latest at the EFF's third National People's Assembly. Mfundo, a very good afternoon to you. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Alicia. It's actually 8 minutes past 3. A very good afternoon to our viewers. We're coming to you live from the NASREC Expo Center. Welcome to our special coverage of the EFF's third National People's Assembly. My name is Mfundo Mabalane, and just to give you a sense of where we are on the program currently, it's actually day 3 as per the program, technically day 2 because day 1 was used just to register the delegates. But if we go according to the program, it's day 3 and they're currently in session 2. This is a closed session. Essentially, what must happen in session 2 is the presentation of the organizational report by the Secretary General, Marshal Dlamini. A bit later on, the Treasurer General is to present her Treasurer General's report, discussion and adoption of those reports, and then a bit later on, the constitutional amendments, presentation of the constitutional amendments, and then discussion and adoption of the Constitution. That will all be part of section or session 2, which is closed. Straight after there, they'll break for lunch, and then the other part, one that seems to be quite important and preoccupying the minds of many, that is the election of the top 6. That will be session 2. It will be open for us now, the media. The first item there will be the elections, the nomination of the top 6, and then after that, the voting, and then they'd go on to outline the commissions. But just to give us a sense, or just unpack what we've heard so far, I'm not alone. I'm with political analyst Yolokazi Mfuto. Yolokazi, good afternoon. You've actually been here the whole day, but it's good afternoon from me at the very least.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us on the program. I want us to start with what has really been the focal point at this point, which is the political report and the subsequent media briefing that the outgoing EFF leader had. Let's start with where he started on his political report, if we had to delve a bit deeper. And that is the EFF's orientation, ideological orientation, which is rooted in Marxism. He went on to state that Marxists must be able to explain in the simplest terms to ordinary citizens what this ideology is all about. Because essentially, people are not married to ideas. They want to benefit the practical things, which is water, which is better roads. Parents need to know that their children after graduating will receive jobs. So really, they want to be able to locate what they can benefit from this greater idea that a political party has. What did you make of just that need to be able to explain in simple terms to ordinary citizens so they can locate where they benefit from this ideology?
Well, Mfundo, the political report was very much packed, right? Firstly, it was diagnostic. He tried to actually give an understanding of where EFF is at and its establishment, what defines the organization. Particularly when he spoke about the Marxism-Leninist approach that EFF uses to address societies and the trouble in society, the problem that society has. They use that lens. But now for the simplified version of it. People should understand that the problem we have in society right now in South Africa, black people were colonized. South Africa was colonized. It's a product of 1885 conference where borders were put into Africa. Thus, South Africa also had then the settlers coming into South Africa.
Partitioning of the world.
Yes, right. And secondly, now, people who are black now are poor and marginalized. They are actually having legacy projects, legacy problems that the apartheid regime has left. So if you're unemployed, you stay in a township, and also you don't have access to education, these problems are not created by you. You have inherited these problems. Thus, it's important that ground forces, they are able to interpret these problems to people, saying that if you don't necessarily stand up for yourself and participate in Sifunda Ngingani, then your kids won't be able to be students in the future. Secondly, people need to have economic freedom. How do we have that? There should be sufficient jobs and that are paying people properly, because it's not necessarily important to just say we've created 300,500 jobs, which are temporary jobs. People are getting paid peanuts, but it should be jobs that people are able to increase their social mobility. People are economically emancipated. And thirdly, it should be people that have black consciousness. It's not necessarily that you should aspire to be white. If you have sufficient money, you must leave the township. Now you want to go into a suburbs because you assimilate, or you say before, because now you have enough money, therefore you must stay with white people. We should make black education fashionable. We should make townships fashionable. We should actually ensure that having black people who are successful should not necessarily be for minority, but everyone else should be successful. But how do we do that? We must also, people should be in charge of the means of production.
Yeah.
The government should ensure that there is industrialization. People have access to the economy.
So it's going to be important for the ground forces to be able to articulate this ideological position of the party in the most practical sense. He then segued into dialectical materialism, which is essentially the conflict of social forces. Now, when we speak of that, he touched on bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which is the working class. I don't know how you found his terminology, because it seemed as though as he was speaking, he was always just almost identifying the bourgeoisie as the threat here. But when one assesses, you could say that in this point, in our context in South Africa, perhaps the threat is not the bourgeoisie, which is the owners of capital or the means of production, but the comprador bourgeoisie, which is what we call the agent of capital. These are the ones that look like you and I, that will infiltrate the space of the working class. Either it could be people disguised as unionists who come into the space of the working class to pacify you, just in the interest to allow the capitalist system, which is oppressive in its nature, to continue to thrive. Do you think the enemy right now becomes the bourgeoisie, or it becomes the agent of capital?
Well, in his inception, it did necessarily say that, yes, bourgeoisie, and also alluding to the middle class. But in honest truth, in South Africa, we don't necessarily have a middle class like that, because people are still in debt. As much as you assume that you have acquired a job that is good, but majority of South Africans are still poor, right? However, now the type of bourgeoisie that we can relate to is the fact that, as you put it, people who join trade unions and they disguise as they are the voice for people who are called voiceless, right? And
where
also,
they are negotiating with
the capital, and then they get to actually put their ideas across and also put themselves across, and then they advance their own business proposals, and also they enrich themselves. But also, this is not limited to only the trade unions. We've seen it as politicians as well. They go and speak as if they're representing the poor, but the type of clothing they are wearing, the type of shoes they are wearing, is not necessarily relating to the people that they claim to represent. So it's quite important that as EFF, and particularly the CIC, when you're speaking about this, he also look into his own organization. What kind of people he has in his CCT? Are they representing the people in terms of how they speak, in terms of how they relate to society? Because as much as we're saying we have ground forces, but the people who are on the top position, they should also be relatable to the people on the ground. They should not be seen as people who are just there to advance. Because we've seen the scandal of the VPS, where we heard that EFF, some members, they benefited irregularly from the VPS. So those are tendencies of bourgeoisie. So if they want to uproot the cancer of bourgeoisie, they should look into the organization itself. So they go outside and speak to people. People understand that
but he
these
seemed
are
to
our
dismiss
own
it.
people.
He seemed to be quick to say bourgeoisies are not people who live in affluent suburbs. It's not the people who drive luxurious cars. It still remains those who own banks, those who own farms. So again, he has identified capital to be the ones who own the means of production. So meaning none of those people then could be considered to be bourgeoisie. Again, taking us to the threat of the agents of capital. That probably what we have here, which evades a lot of people, is the comprador bourgeoisie, which is the one in the middle that allows for the system to continue. But all of these subjects, nevertheless, or topics and themes, are very esoteric. It's one of those themes where, when looking at the political report, when he was speaking on Leninism and Marxism, it's not still, because there was criticism towards the media that perhaps they're elevating gossip when one question was posed on Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. But one wonders that, is it not a case where some people, some of these topics, if you're going to talk about Marxism, unless it is explained in the simplest way as he has instructed the ground forces, they remain very exclusionary topics?
They are. I mean, the topic of, if you speak about ideology, then you speak politics, you speak sociology, and now they want to use epistemologies, intelligence, and stuff, and sort of like that. And these also, this is an English language, this is a colonial language that we're using. It then becomes more important that, as much as you're writing English, beautiful English, maybe you translate in isiXhosa and you see how it's going to sound. but also use the simple terms, use the simple English, and also use a language people understand on a daily basis. Why do we have people in the robots each day? We have young men queuing, asking for jobs, a plumber and end. Why are these people not in the system? Why are they not professional plumbers? Why are they not professional housekeepers? Why do they have to stand on the road for them to actually access job? And what kind of people are these? They come from townships. They are black women. They are black men. Why don't we see white people also doing the same thing? Who owns the means of production? So if they explain this in the terms that people understand, probably even the constituency of the EFF would increase. Because sometimes, of course, as the EFF has been deemed as an organization that prioritizes education, but we still look at people who are educated as elite. They become aloof. They start to want to
intellectualize everything. And he even stated that we need to guard against intellectualizing everything to the point where we cannot locate it in the most practical sense. And he termed it academicism. That they must also guard against that, in as much as they want to be a political party that encourages knowledge. But they've got to understand that the voters must be explained to in the simplest of terms. It then takes me to his response to the question on Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, because this is where he criticized the media to a certain extent to say you didn't want to engage with the political report, which we have engaged, in fact. But then again, as conduits in this whole process of democracy, ours is to serve as a link between the citizens and the leaders. So we cannot, I would like to believe, abuse the access or proximity to leaders to only talk about the things we want to talk about, which is the political report. Because when you look on social media, you've got citizens that want to know of the absence of a CCT member. This is a member of parliament who perhaps we understand it to be that he's not eligible to be part of this conference. So it would be remiss of the media to have not asked such a question, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. And also he was quite dismissive, and to use the young people's language, gaslighting, when he was, we're not going to entertain this. We had a report.
It's don't want done.
Yes, but it can't dismiss the role that the former Commissar Dr. Mbuyiseni Ndlozi has played in the EFF in current political landscape. Because, I mean, he was a spokesperson. He was called People's Bay. Some people joined the EFF because they saw his charisma, the way he debates in parliament, the way he sings as well. Those are very important characteristics of a leader, particularly a political leader. So you can't just dismiss it, and when people are asking about him, they are seen as gossipers. Because had they dismissed this lie before, when he was saying that it's a toilet gossip, right? If they had announced, made a press briefing or any sort to say no, he's not coming on this basis, or he announces on his on himself and say, I'm not coming to the conference on this basis, I've been bad, or I'm not feeling like going, or I'm leaving the organization, that would be sufficient.
Yeah, the matter would have been dispensed with at that point.
Yes, and now he's just dismissing it, and also now and it's going to have ramifications for other people. Who else are we going to see? They will just leave the organization without announcement.
Because he said something yesterday that for them, internal democracy is sacrosanct, that if they do not guard it jealously, they could fall into this trap or this direction of fascism. And democracy and transparency are interlinked. So in this instance, if we heard from the EFF that you've got non-voting delegates today, they've expressed the criteria and said those wouldn't have met the threshold of the 10%. So that is the EFF's criteria as to why those people will not be participating fully. Even in this instance, perhaps it would have been beneficial to say, perhaps there has been an internal process when Mbuyiseni Ndlozi is concerned. Perhaps he's suspended for 6 months for not disclosing what he knew about those that were going to leave, whatever the case may be. And they just bring it out as a form of being transparent because they style themselves as a government in waiting. And if you're a government in waiting, you will have to display these democratic processes which are linked to transparency.
Yes, that's correct. But of course, we've seen EFF has been very controversial with issues of democracy. Some people have left the organization from Anlim Clintama saying that the president is allegedly a dictator. It's his way or the highway, right? And even now in this case, there's no transparency in terms of what is really happening. The only thing people know in the media knows the fact that Mbuyiseni is actually lambasted because he did not tell the CIC that Floyd Shivambu was leaving the organization, which I believe it was not his jurisdiction, because had he told him and he would not leave the organization, then it would be seen as a wedge, a creator between the two leaders. So I don't think he should be blamed for not saying it, because it was not his right, his space for him to intervene, right? But also if the president is not addressing the issue correctly, because now he's just insinuating that the relationship between himself as a CIC and Ndlozi is done on what he has been saying. Initially, he said some of them are leaving, they sing beautifully, they are loved by the public. Then
so he's inadvertently elevating the situation of this individual, especially at a conference as important as this one in any case, by dismissing the media on that question.
Yeah, definitely. And also, with Ndlozi's silence, I would say maybe it's golden, because I do think that he is actually giving us a view that he's a disciplined member of the EFF. He was just saying, retweeting and posting about the organization. He did not say anything untoward about the organization, and probably now his silence is actually bringing more questions from the media. And now we see with the EFF the way they're responding, they are taking it kindly. So I do think that if they're not transparent about such issues, it's going to have very hectic ramifications, because people are going to ask, and also what happens when someone else leaves the organization like this.
I wish we had more time, because I just now wanted to delve into some of the discussion documents, very important issues around Africanism as well as internationalism.
Yes.
Perhaps we can just touch on one, pardon me. Just if we look at the EFF's foreign policy, in that media briefing now, he touched a little bit on it, because when looking at their foreign policy, or what they call the discussion document on Africanism and internationalism, it hasn't moved away from their founding manifesto, which is, for them, they would be a party that is against Western forces, which is against neo-colonial powers. So they want to dismantle those kind of powers. So in essence, you have something that today would probably emerge as really not much of a move from the original founding manifesto on at least Pan-Africanism and internationalism. But it goes on to say that when it comes to a borderless Africa, he does not mean that people should not be documented. And when listening to that, some could probably at home say it makes a bit of sense if ever they thought people would be moving in between countries or states without any documentation. Is it a problem then of the inability to articulate this foreign policy that has had many people scared?
Yes, definitely. Initially, just before elections, when EFF was speaking about the immigration policies that they want to put into place, some people were like, no, this is not going to work out. I think the way they communicated it was not necessarily tailored for the public, and also they left some gaps. And then when they speak about the organization itself as a Pan-Africanist organization, they seek to undo what colonialism did, and also they want to align with African movements and other African parties to ensure that Africa is liberated. And I do think that's a quite progressive policy, because if you want to travel to Senegal, imagine you have to start landing in Qatar, and then you come back to Africa. There's no straight direct flight. And secondly, we see other Africans as competitors. With the issues of xenophobia, for instance, they are not articulated properly, because we say foreigners are only black people. We don't see white people as foreigners. So this, if this can be taken down to grassroots, where people understand the plight of other African states, because it's one thing for South Africa to be great and have a Sandton or Johannesburg booming as a market. However, if Mozambique is burning, South Africa will not be great. So it's important that as we grow our economy in South Africa, the other countries, our neighboring countries, are also doing well. As he did mention about Europe, for instance, you can have lunch in Spain, have dinner in Italy, in one area. So why can't it happen for Africans? And I think for tourism as well, and also for business, imagine if we have such policies, the Africa Trade Agreement, which actually is tailored to ensure that Africa is growing. It would be easier for people to trade. It would be easier for you to get a dress in Ghana, in Nigeria, and so on and so forth. And you not see them as foreigners, but as people who you can collaborate with, and also our economy would grow.
Your views on their posture towards multilateral institutions. There's been a call, even the UN Secretary General has on numerous occasions called for the reform of some of these multilateral institutions. Their posture and just their documentations around the IMF, the World Bank, it seems there is just that antagonistic posture towards these institutions. Your views?
Well, it's very much inevitable that EFF would be antagonistic against these organizations, because we know how IMF and World Bank has tried by all means to actually exploit African countries with the disguise that we're offering funding for rebuild. Remember the structural adjustment policies that we put into place where they dictate how money should be spent, and also how we should lower down our regulations on taxes for companies to come in and mining and end. So it's quite important that we want reform of the United Nations itself. The Security Council is occupied by people who are still wanting to colonize African states. So how do we think they are going to support us in wanting us to join the United Nations Security Council?
When most of the decisions they actually impact Africa.
Yeah, exactly. They have veto rights. So even if Sudan is banning, the UN would not necessarily have anything to do there, because they will veto the right if they want to deploy military. So Africa will still be in fire until the United Nations Security Council is reformed. And secondly, the IMF and the World Bank, they're dependent on the people who are putting more money. They're putting the rules. They're putting the conditions on how funding can get it. Because in COVID, we got money from the IMF and we got money from the World Bank. But check our debt in South Africa. We can't even pronounce the numbers of the debt, because these countries, they continue to take out of South Africa and of the continent. And this is not going to serve its people.
And hopefully, since we are now holding the G20 presidency, this is something that they will discuss, the cost of debt. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll most certainly continue this conversation, because for us, it's an all-nighter. We'll be here the all night. Alicia, thank you very much. That's where we leave it.